you can try harder and you can focus more and you can even change your strategy. And I can still measure how sensitive you actually are to detecting reality. And as we're going to see today, sometimes that ability is much lower than you think. So we're going to see how we test this with a very simple star field. And then we're going to use this to analyze the potential dangers of interpersonal relationships and, importantly, possible ways to fix these issues. So this is all in service of understanding that weird and wonderful thing that we call the human mind. So I use this portion of our meetings to kind of suggest different ways about thinking of the human mind. And this one is actually one of my favorites, which is the idea of fractals. And fractals are mathematical constructs where they are self-repeating in ways that are infinite. So when you zoom into a fractal, you encounter the same structure again and again and again, no matter how far you zoom into it. And one of the big mysteries of psychology and cognitive psychology specifically is consciousness. So what is consciousness? Why do we have consciousness? Why are we aware of these experiences that we have in our mind? Because one thing that AI has shown us, if AI does not have consciousness, consciousness is not required for a lot of intelligent things. So the question becomes whether we have consciousness and how do we understand that? Well, one possibility is that our minds are actually created in a sort of fractal organization where you can kind of move up and down in your mind at different levels of analysis, but it's always the kind of same mind that you encounter. And maybe this is why we might not have consciousness, but it feels like we have consciousness. Because the one thing that this would allow for is that experience that we have thoughts. So then you go up a level, you zoom out of that fractal mind structure, and you have the ability to look at your thoughts. And this is awareness, right? This is consciousness. You're aware that you have thoughts. So we have level one, you have thoughts. Then you zoom out of that and you're aware that you have thoughts. This is Descartes. I think, therefore I am. But you can zoom up one more level and you can be aware of the fact that you're aware that you have thoughts. So you can be aware that you're conscious, right? So you're not just conscious of thoughts, but you're conscious of being conscious of thoughts. And then you can try this again and zoom up again and say, well, I'm aware that I'm aware that I'm aware of thoughts. But eventually this breaks down in terms of being meaningful. Because eventually you'll get to the point where you're thinking, I'm aware that 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 I have thoughts. And at that point, you're not really sure what you're aware of. So it might be that we have this kind of pseudo fractal organization for our minds, but it only mimics consciousness because it's not an infinite fractal, and we reach the limits when we reach that aware of being aware of being aware of being aware loss of meaningfulness. All right, so I just wanted to plant that in there, and I will tell you this. In this course, we will not answer how we have consciousness or tackle how it's represented, how it's implemented. But I will say this, if you ever do crack the mystery of consciousness and you can show what consciousness is and importantly, how it's implemented in a physical symbol system, just do me a favor, thank me when you accept your Nobel Prize. And because I would like just a smidge, just a little bit of recognition for maybe planting that in your fractal mind. All right. I was going to say in all seriousness, but I'm dead serious. That is like one of the holy grail problems of psychology. But we're going to take a look at something that has been very well understood right now, which is signal detection. So once again, how do you determine between somebody's perceptual ability versus their decision criteria when those two intermix to cause behavior? And that's what signal detection was all about. So today we're actually going to do a little bit of a reverse move and we're going to take it from the real world and we're going to go back to the lab just to kind of see some of the basics now that we can appreciate a little bit more about signal detection. But then we're going to finish up in the real world with real world applications and implications. And we're going to look at how signal detection theory can help us understand some really messy, emotional, important topics such as sexual harassment and the Me Too movement. We're going to take a look at some research on power and biases in sexual interest as well, and see what the implications of that might be for any policy where we try to make relationships more safe and also make relationships more efficient and effective. And we'll see more of that. But first, back to the COG lab. So COG lab number 4 is signal detection. In this COG lab, you had randomly placed dots that were displayed, and that is your star field. And then the target was an additional set of 10 dots, and these would slant. This was a slant line that slanted downward from left to right, and your task was to determine if the target was present in the star field. So it was either going to be present, target is there, or it's absent, target is not there. And then the variable here was the number of distractors, that is the size of the star field. So sometimes there were 144 stars on display, sometimes there were 400, and then sometimes there were 1,000. So this is a very classic signal detection paradigm in order to test sensitivity. In this case, we have the star field, which is the noise. So it has things that look like the target, which is the dots, but it's not the target. The target is not present in the star field. And then you have the target, which is the signal, and that signal gets added to the noise. So you have your signal plus noise. So what does this look like? Well, in the 144 star field, you had a display that looked like this. And in this case, you might say that, yes, I do see that line of dots. It's right there. So you would say present. And in that case, you would be correct. And then a 400 star field looked more like this. And in this case, we also have that slanted line. So you would say present and you would be correct in that case. And then we have the 1,000 star field. So here's an example of that. And this is an example of where there's just noise. There's no signal. There's no target present. So in this case, the correct answer would be absent. There is no slanted line. So what happened? What were the results for each of those 3 conditions? So let's start off with the 144 star field results. So there on the x-axis, we have our evidence, and the evidence increases as you go from left to right. So in this case, we have that blue distribution. That is your signal plus noise distribution. And then we have the frequency of impressions on the left side. So basically, the higher the line, the more often that amount of evidence would be present. But importantly for this study and for this analysis of your sensitivity to the target in the star field, we were able to measure your hits, your false alarms, your correct rejections, and your misses after you did this COG lab. So the data is right there. So we had, when the target was present, 94% of the time, you said, yes, I see it. So those were hits. When the target was present, only 6% of the time did you not see the target and you said it was absent. Those were misses. And 23% of the time you saw a target when there was no target actually present, and those were false alarms. And then 77% of the time, there was no target there, and you said, no, the target is absent, and you were correct, and those were correct rejections. So what we can do with those numbers is we can take a look at the signal plus noise distribution when the target was present in the star field. And we know that that's the shape of the distribution. So how much of that distribution is 94% of the distribution? Because that entire distribution is all the answers when the when the target was present. So every single time the target was present is in there. And 94% of the time when the target was present, you said it was there. So that represented in that curve is that area right there. So that is 94% of this curve. And those are your hits. And it has to be that 94% because your hits are 94. So we need 94% of that star field plus target distribution to be hits. And that's how we get 94% hits. If 94% is hits, you'll notice that the rest of it has to be misses, and 6% are misses, and the misses are right there. So once we have those two pieces of information, where the hits are and where the misses are, then we can figure out where our criterion is. How much evidence do we need before we're going to say, yes, we see the target? And the criterion is right there. So then the last thing we need to measure our sensitivity is the noise distribution. And for the noise distribution, these are the responses you made when the target was not there. And the target was not there during the correct rejections, and the target was not there during the false alarms. And you can see that the correct rejections are 77%. The false alarms are 23%. So we need to position our noise distribution, the star field distribution, we need to position it so that criterion line cuts it into a 77%, 23% split. And the only place we can do that is right there. So now we have 77% of that noise distribution being correct rejections, 23% of that noise distribution being false alarms. And then once you have those two distributions figured out where they are, you can use the formulas for normal distributions in order to figure out where the peaks are. We're not going to need to do that. That's grad school stuff. But for our purposes, to understand what is going on here, once you know your hits and your misses, that fixes where your star field and your target distribution is and where your criterion is. Then when you have false alarms and correct rejections, that fixes where your noise distribution is. And when you have those two fixed in position, you can measure top to top, and that gives you a measure of your sensitivity. So in this case, we got a D prime of 2.85. And the easiest way to understand D prime, don't worry about, well, how sensitive is that? You know, on a scale of 1 to sensitive, like what is a 2.85? Just know that for any situation, the higher your D prime, the more sensitive you are. The lower your D prime, the less sensitive you are. So don't really look at it in terms of an absolute number. Look at it in terms more of 2.85. We're going to measure other situations relative to that amount of sensitivity. So that 2.85 is the distance between the two peaks. And that is our first measure of sensitivity for the 144 star field. Any questions at all on that before we go to the next situation? All right. What about the 400 star field results? Well, for the 400 star field results, we can do the exact same analysis. So we have our signal plus target distribution, star field plus target. We measure our hits, false alarms, correct rejections, and misses. And once again, we just start figuring out where each of those sections are. So the hits is 70% of that star field plus target distribution. That is 70% of the distribution right there. Those are the hits. The misses have to be the rest of the distribution. Those are your misses right there. So we now know where our criterion is. One thing that you may have noticed is that the hits and the misses, they will always add up to 100 because you either do one or the other. 100% of the time, you're either going to hit it or you're going to miss it when the target is present. False alarms and correct rejections, they also have to add up to 100% because when the target is not there, you only have two choices. You're either going to correctly reject or you're going to false alarm. So just know that some of this information is redundant and you can figure it out from the other information. So if I said, hey, my hits were 70% and you said, well, your misses must have been 30%, I wouldn't be surprised that you knew that. I wouldn't be like, how are you reading my mind? No, it just has to be that. That's just the way that it mathematically works. Importantly, however, Now that we know where the hits are, where the misses are, and where our criterion line has to be, because it has to be at that point that splits the hits and the misses into 70 and 30%, we now know where the noise distribution has to go. It has to go where the false alarms are 39% and the correct rejections are 61% of the curve. So that's 61%, that green area, that's 39%, the false alarms. Again, we measure tip to tip, and now we have a D prime of 0.99. So it used to be 2.85, highly sensitive to the target when you had 144 stars in your star field. Now that we upped it to 400, our sensitivity has dropped down to D prime of 0.99. So the last one that we're going to take a look at is what happens in the, I believe it was supposed to be 1,000 stars star field. So what happens in the 1,000 stars situation? Well, in this case, we have very different hits, false alarms, correct rejections, and misses. And again, we plot that with our star field and target, our noise plus target distribution. In this case, our hits have dropped to 61% of the time. So we're only correct in seeing the target in the star field 61% of the time. And then 39% of the time we miss it. And that is 61% and 39%. That puts our criterion right there. And we know that our criterion is right there. So now for the false alarms and correct rejections, that fixes where those has to be, because our noise distribution is going to be placed on top of that criterion. So that criterion splits it into 51% false alarms, 49% correct rejections. And it's going to be a little difficult to see this, but that's where that noise distribution is. And if you take a look at the numbers, what this indicates is that for the noise distribution, you were basically guessing. It's 51% false alarms, 49% correct rejections. That's probably not statistically different from 50-50. So when that star field was present, but there was no target, we were just guessing. Kind of like, I think I see it, I don't think I see it, and it was at about 50-50%. So when you take a look at the distance between those two peaks, now our sensitivity has dropped all the way down to 0.29. So our D prime has decreased. So we can still have some detection, right? Our hits, notice our hits are 61% and our misses are 0.39. So we are detecting somewhat, but you can see that our sensitivity has dropped down dramatically. And we just cannot do a very good job here. We have high rates of false alarms, high rates of misses. You can see that it is a much different story than for the 144 or 400 star field. All right, so did your sensitivity to the target change as the star field increased from 144 to 400 to 1,000 dots? Yes, it did. That is what the signal detection theory measures. It measured that change in sensitivity from 2.85 to 0.99 all the way down to 0.29. But now let's take a look at some of the more interesting possibilities here. And the first one is whether or not your strategy changed as you went through this procedure. So did anybody here change their strategy as they went from 144 stars to 400 to 1,000 stars? So nobody changed their strategy at all when they were detecting this? Okay, so let me ask you this. Did anybody in the 1,000 star field situation just start thinking to themselves, well, this is impossible. This is unfair. This is not something I can actually do. So I'm just going to start guessing yes more often. I see a couple of people nodding their heads. Okay, so if you were guessing more often, anybody want to speculate? What would guessing more often do to your hit rate? Mm-hmm. it would decrease the hit rate. So what's your thought process on that?
You don't know how many times out of confidential short it's gonna be there, so it could either be there more times and you'll get a higher hit rate, but a couple more misses, or
Okay. So the idea is that if you start guessing, then you're going to start getting more misses. Because if you're just guessing across the entire gamut of times, you don't know whether it's there, you don't know whether it's not there. So if you really truly changed your strategy to the point where you were just guessing, then what would happen is your hit rate would go down. Because our hit rate was up at 61%, and it would go down to 50%. Our false alarm rate was already at about 50%. So that kind of indicates to me a little bit that guessing actually did start to occur, because a 50% false rate versus 50% correct rejection rate, that's basically guessing. That's indicating that at least some part of us was guessing. But we did still have 61% hit rates. So what would that be an indication that we were doing in this star field? Mhm.
it would take a longer time to answer whether the dots are there. Just take a longer.
So that could indicate that we were taking longer times to indicate whether the dot was there. So we were collecting more evidence and looking for more. I don't want to use the word evidence again, but we were looking for more evidence so that we can kind of push ourselves into that signal plus noise ratio. So we might have said to ourselves, all right, where this thing used to pop out at me and I would get all this evidence immediately, I would be like, well, there's that line. I have all this evidence immediately. Now we might say to ourselves, well, I got to take more time on this. So is it in this little section? Let me use my attention and I'll focus it on this little section, and I will go and do a serial processing rather than parallel processing. And I will try to figure this out. Maybe I'll go here. Maybe I'll go here. So that would be a change in your strategy, not necessarily a change in your criterion, but it definitely would be a change in your strategy. And we must have been doing something, because if we did just adopt a purely guessing situation, we would go to 50-50, and we were at 61-39 on the actual hits versus misses. So it seems that there were kind of two strategies at play, and or maybe one strategy at play where it was spend a certain amount of time analyzing the image, and if you see it, then click present, right? So if you definitely processed it enough where you're like, well, there's that line, I'm going to click present. And if you don't see it, then guess. Because in the 1000 star field, you never saw the line. And yet we had 50% false alarms, 50% correct rejections. That's an indication that we were guessing. And since you don't know whether or not the target was present or not unless you saw it, that extra 10% that we got in the hits, that was when you processed it enough, maybe went in that serial attention way and found those lines and said, okay, yes, for sure, I see it. A large chunk of your hits, when you got it correct, were times when you just did not see it and you thought to yourself, I'm just going to guess. And actually, just as a real quick aside, you can actually kind of predict that and figure out how many times we actually saw the star field and confidently saw the target and confidently said, yes, I see it. Because if the misses are 0.39% of the time, and that is due to a 50-50 strategy, then 0.39 of your hits were guesses. So if your misses are 0.39, 0.39 of your hits are guesses, and 6.1 minus 0.39, we're looking at what, 22? So 22% of the time you actually saw it and you actually said, yes, I see it. The rest of the time you were guessing. And that's what allows us, or that's what gives us this final analysis. So that again is kind of some of the reasoning that this allows you to do. And it allows you to detangle strategies, changes in strategies from people's perceptual ability. All right, and now another question that's going to tie into some of the things we're talking about today. Did your personal experience change from 144 to 400 to 1,000 dots? So what did it feel like in the 144 dot condition versus what did it feel like in the 1,000 dot condition?
The 1,000 dot condition for you is exponentially more difficult to identify the target successfully than the 144 dot condition.
Okay, so the 1,000 dot condition was exponentially more difficult than the 144 dot condition. So how did that feel when you were actually doing it?
I guess it was a little frustrating.
Just because I feel like it was pretty easy with the first two symbols. And then in that third one, there were just so many stars that, it looked like they were in a line, but they weren't.
Quite exactly how they were supposed to be oriented.
And then you would give your answer and you would get you wouldn't get the correct feedback. You get the not correct feedback. Yeah. So did anybody else have a different experience? Did anybody else get to the 1,000 star field and think to themselves, this is amazing. I love this one. Nobody thought 144 was too easy and you're finally glad that you're getting this massive challenge? Okay, so it seems like we're all in agreement. I did this Cog Lab myself, and I remember the 1,000 star field sucked. Like it was not fun. It was basically incredibly difficult, got very frustrating. And yeah, I mean, the 144, you're just bopping along. You're just like, hey, there it is. Hey, I don't see it there. That's great. And then the 1,000 comes along and you hit a brick wall and you're trying your best and you're still just not good enough. You're not sensitive enough to make those distinctions. So there definitely is an emotional cost to being in situations like the 1,000 star field where it's very difficult to determine if the target is there. There's a definite cost to this particular situation. So in general, if you are at all in a position to create a situation where you can communicate to people whether a target is there or not, it is very cognitively and mental health helpful to allow people to see targets as easily as possible. So this is just to give you a brief example. If you are a boss of other people, so let's say that you leave IU and you get a job where you are in charge of other individuals. It does not matter as much in terms of employee satisfaction and employee flourishing and getting a productive and happy team. It doesn't really matter what your style of being a boss is. So you can be that happy-go-lucky individual. You can be the one that's angry all the time. You can be like a really stern, we got to meet productivity goals. You can be a really caring, hey, you know what, it's okay. You can, come and talk to me or whatever. But the number one thing to do is to let people know how you are feeling at any particular time. And what I mean by that is that if you are in a good mood, smile and be really happy. If you are in a bad mood, frown, don't smile whatsoever. The more people can predict what's going to happen when they encounter you, the happier they will be, the more well-adjusted your team will be, even if you're angry all the time, right? As long as you look angry when you're angry, they're going to be able to deal with that a lot better than if they're confused. So looking angry when you're angry and looking happy when you're happy is the target in a 144 star field. And when they're seeing that, even if you're angry, even if the target is not there, they know it and they can adjust their behavior. This is when you have a boss that has a poker face and you're just wondering, should I ask them for a raise now? Is this a good time to bring up maybe, working towards that promotion? I'm having difficulty with a certain project. Is this a good time to, that is when it gets stressful. So this situation here is incredibly stressful. And just to do a really quick callback, we've seen this situation in our previous class when we took a look at the study by Sassler and Miller on waiting to be asked with the cohabiting couples. And we talked about the false alarms of the women who pursued the first date or first sexual encounter with partners were, in the words of one rueful woman, shot down. And the result of all those false alarms was that rueful woman. And you felt it. You felt it in a really less intense, less socially important situation where you were taking a look at stars in a star field. But yeah, that situation right there that we talked about last class, that would lead to somebody having a high amount of false alarms in this dating situation, for example. That looks a lot like that 1,000 star field example. So no wonder the experimenters thought, yeah, this is rueful. This woman has had a experience that has made her rueful, because again, imagine if you lived in a world where this was important and you were still in that situation. Lots of false alarms, basically guessing. It gets to be very, very frustrating. All right, so now we're going to turn to real world applications and we'll spend the rest of today's class on those. So we're going to take a look at some ways of understanding things that have happened historically in terms of our culture and in terms of intimate relations and intimate relationships and how those are started and the minefield that can cause. And we'll take a look at one study that tries to pinpoint exactly what is going on and analyze it all in terms of a signal detection type paradigm. But let's start with the historical context of interpersonal relationships, and that is the Me Too movement. So the Me Too movement started, 2017. So it's almost a decade old at this point. So just to kind of give you a brief history of this culturally extremely important shift that occurred. So Me Too's explosion into mainstream all began with a simple tweet by Alyssa Milano back in 2017 with Harvey Weinstein front and center, creating a movement against male violence, harassment, and sexual abuse. If all the women who have been sexually assaulted or harassed wrote Me Too as a status, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem, she wrote at the time. Immediately, there was a cultural shift in how we speak about these issues at all. So I forgot to mention it. This is from an article from 2024. So it's a couple of years old. Lots of things have changed, but it's a nice kind of overview of the situation. So what happened as a result of this cultural shift? He goes, those who have been convicted include Danny Masterson, who was found guilty on 2 counts of rape in May 2023. R. Kelly was convicted of 8 counts of sex trafficking and 1 count of racketeering. And though one of Harvey Weinstein's convictions has been overturned, his other conviction of rape and sexual assault still stands. So that's just a really, really brief overview of the movement. But importantly, it mentions that immediately there was a cultural shift in how we speak about these issues at all, these issues of sexual harassment. And whenever you see that word immediately, in a signal detection paradigm, there is only really one thing that can change immediately. So your sensitivity will not increase or decrease immediately, right? That is something that is a skill. It can be taught, it can be learned, but it is definitely not immediate. So when they're talking about an immediate change in the way that people think about these issues, they're talking about not a change in sensitivity. So again, we have this signal detection version that is generalizable to kind of like any level of a relationship, but you have your noise plus target distribution, and these are individuals that want sexual attention. So put yourself in the position of somebody who needs to make a decision as to whether or not you're going to give somebody sexual attention or not give somebody that sexual attention. And then you have the individuals who want sexual attention. You have the individuals who do not want sexual attention. And then you have your criterion based on evidence that you perceive. And if you give sexual attention to somebody who wants sexual attention, that's a hit. If you do not give sexual attention to somebody who wants sexual attention, that's a miss. If you do not give sexual attention to somebody who does not want sexual attention, that's a correct rejection. And then the problematic one is when you give sexual attention to somebody who does not want sexual attention, and that's a false alarm. And that is where sexual harassment occurs. And then depending upon the level of sexual attention, it goes into sexual assault and it goes into more extreme versions of that. But we'll keep it PG as much as we possibly can. So let's talk about these cultural shifts. So one of the things, there was some strategies that people who sexually harassed or sexually assaulted other individuals, there was a certain strategy that they would often use to indicate as evidence that the other person was not part of the do not want sexual attention distribution. They were actually part of the want sexual attention distribution. So does anybody want to speculate or remember what some of those arguments might have been? Yep. So their clothing. So what the person was wearing was oftentimes brought up. And I think they have to, I don't know exactly legally if they have to pass a law that can no longer be entered into evidence, but that was taken as evidence that the person actually did want sexual attention. So if they were saying now that they did not want sexual attention, that's a lie, because what they were wearing indicated that they were part of that want sexual attention. Any other strategies that individuals would use to say, hey, that person is lying because all right, I'll give you a hint. Can anybody finish this sentence? I did not sexually assault that person because why would I sexually assault them when you're close? You're close. You said that they were ugly. So what does that mean in terms of available sexual partners? So it's implicit in what you said. So what was that? I don't want them. It's we're almost there. Does anybody want to speculate? So they're ugly and I don't want them because I still want to have sexual activity, but they are ugly and I don't want them because of what? They're not attractive. They're not my type. But what does that imply? So let me ask you this. Let's say that you were at a buffet, right? And you thought to yourself, you know what? I don't really want. I'm not going to go and get the chicken wings at this buffet, right? If you're super hungry, you might say, I'm not going to get the chicken wings at this buffet because you can get anything else that you might want. You can say, hey, you know what? I really like pizza, so I'm going to get myself some pizza. Or I really like the filet mignon, so I'm going to, well, they're not going to, I like the spare rib, so I'm going to get myself some spare rib. I don't want the chicken fingers. So does that seem like a reasonable thing that people would do? if they were hungry? Okay, what if you go into that buffet and you get to the buffet and there's just chicken fingers and there's nothing else? Would that person say, oh my gosh, I am hungry, I am starving here, but chicken fingers? No, thank you. Doesn't seem like a reasonable thing. Yep. We're dancing around it a little bit. We're so very close. So this is, I mean, it's one of the things that I will mention about these types of analyses, and one of the things that kind of makes this important to do, this work is important, but is oftentimes avoided. And one of the reasons is that much like when we talked about AI and we were talking about intelligence, and we mentioned that once people know how something is done, oftentimes they no longer consider it intelligent. So, writing a summary of an article, that's an example of intelligence. But once we know how AI can do that, well, then all of a sudden we're like, well, that's not really intelligent. Once you find the causes of something, in a similar way, oftentimes the responsibility that we feel belongs to the people that are doing these behaviors goes away. So it's sort of like when you see somebody and they're doing really bad antisocial behavior, and you're like, well, look how, bad and antisocial that individual is. But then you find out, well, no, they have alcoholic parents who got divorced and they've been in the foster system for years and they, have never received any support. And all of a sudden, it's not that the responsibility for that antisocial behavior goes away, but you sort of feel less like it's their fault and less like it's their responsibility. That happens a lot when we're talking about issues like this, because as psychologists, we want to understand it. We need to understand it. This is human behavior. It's ugly, but it's human behavior. And part of our job as psychologists is to prevent and get around and eradicate the ugly human behavior. So sometimes we just have these kind of mental blocks where I don't think we can really sort of do that, because a lot of times we feel like if we explain this, then we somehow excuse the ugly behavior, which is not the case, but it is a sort of innate feeling that we have. So we were dancing around it. We came really close. The person that they slept with that they sexually assaulted, they're ugly. They're not attractive. And the corollary to that is that person is it's going to sound very callous. That person is a chicken finger, and I don't like chicken fingers. So why would I eat chicken fingers when I can go get some prime rib whenever I want it? And that was one of the big arguments. It's like, I did not sleep with that person. I did not sexually assault them. They were consensual, because why would I sexually assault them when I can get any other woman that I want? Right? That was a defense that was oftentimes used. It was like, I'm a powerful person. I have all of these opportunities. Women are throwing themselves at me. So why would I sexually assault anybody when I can just turn around and have, I just don't know how to say this, have relations with this particular person. So that is Georgina Chapman. That, I'm not sure if she is still, that was actually Harvey Weinstein's wife. So again, the idea is, why would they assault anybody if they have access to much more attractive individuals? And I always get a little bit nervous when I'm talking about this, because sometimes I just kind of feel like, I don't know, it just seems weird to categorize people like this. So oftentimes when I get a little bit nervous about this and what reactions might be, I kind of feel like I go default to science. So that is why in this next slide, it kind of explains it. Just in case you disagree with what beauty is, you can rank beauty according to science. And they actually did that in this article. And apparently, according to science, the most beautiful woman in the world is Bella Hadid. And that is because her score of 94.35 tops the latest golden ratio percentages, which calculates the symmetry and proportion of facial features to measure beauty. So the argument had been before that when these individuals were making their decisions and when they were saying, I'm going to approach that person or I'm not going to approach that person, or I'm going to initiate sexual relations or give sexual attention to that person, but I'm not going to do it to this other person. The idea was that for evidence, they were using beauty, right? So what made their decision, what had them decide that, yes, I'm going to pursue this, but I'm not going to pursue this other individual, was beauty. And if you take a look at the distribution of beauty in our society, it does tend to be on this kind of normal distribution. And their argument was, well, if this is the situation here, and we're using beauty as a criterion there, then we are only asking these women for sexual attention. We're only giving these women here sexual attention. So it's gotta be that these are mostly misses, right? These other individuals, the ones that do not want sexual attention, well, they're getting correctly rejected, right? We didn't have to go and force ourselves on them. We correctly rejected them because we only really deal with high evidence, high levels of beauty. So that reduces the amount of women that we would actually have hits and misses with. It's a little bit more complicated than this, but this does give you an indication that beauty was used as evidence post assault, as evidence of whether or not the person was intended or the person was receptive or was not receptive. It used to be the case that if a person was not beautiful or considered by our society as beautiful, that they could not possibly have been a false alarm because they would have been automatically a correct rejection. Yep.
What if somebody with high levels of beauty didn't want to have sex?
So what if somebody with high levels of beauty didn't want to have sex with them? That is a good point. That is where this one kind of crumbles a little bit, because we would need to like double the number of graphs that we have here, because that's a different situation. But you're absolutely right. In that case, if you restrict it to just beautiful women, then what that does is it gets rid of beauty as evidence, right? Because if they're all basically equally beautiful, if they all score in the 90s on that golden ratio scale, let's say, for example, then beauty as evidence is no longer available because it doesn't differentiate between anything. So now you have a new situation where you can't rely on that anymore for an indication of whether or not they would have accepted the sexual offer. So that would be a completely different situation. So you're absolutely right to call this out. This is a little bit incomplete in terms of what happens when you're just dealing with beautiful women. Any other comments or questions or speculations? All right. So they mentioned again that immediately there was a shift in how we speak about these issues at all. And as I mentioned, that immediate shift has to be the criterion. It has to be a shift in where that line is, because again, sensitivity can be trained, it can be increased, but that doesn't happen immediately. That immediate shift did not happen because the signal and signal plus noise distributions got further apart. That immediate shift occurred because that criterion went down. And it basically said, hey, we can't have this criterion anymore because we have way too many false alarms. We need to change that particular criterion. And that is what led to the immediate shift. So in this case, if this was a situation pre-Me Too, which way would the criterion shift post-Me Too? Would it shift to the right, that you require more evidence, or would it shift to the left, that you require less evidence? it would shift to the right, that you require more evidence. Because the one thing that you want to get away, the one thing that Me Too and that movement made very costly was the false alarms, right? So all of a sudden, those false alarms went from something that you could sweep under the rug to something that was published in a newspaper, and you were losing your job, you were losing financial opportunities, you were losing your friends, it was costing a lot. So in that case, that criterion got moved to the right because we had to get rid of those false alarms. All right, so we're going to talk about another situation, one that I kind of feel never really got enough attention, and also gives you a really interesting insight into how you can take a look at these issues in a signal detection theory paradigm to disentangle things and really see sometimes how ludicrous certain arguments are. So this is Asia Argento, and she is the daughter of famed horror movie director Dario Argento. And I will read from her Wikipedia page because this is going on YouTube, so I have to be really careful with how many times I say alleged. So I will read from the Wikipedia page. So the New York Times published allegations that Argento sexually assaulted actor Jimmy Bennett. If true, this would have been deemed statutory rape, as Bennett was legally a minor under California law. So this happened in California, and he was a minor under California law. On the 22nd of August, she released a statement reading, "I strongly deny and oppose the contents of the New York Times article. I have never had any sexual relationship with Bennett." And then later, following Argento's denials, in a text message to model Rian Dove, in the screenshots, Argento reportedly stated, "I had sex with him. It felt weird. I didn't know he was a minor until the shakedown letter." And then finally, Argento's attorney admitted there was a sexual encounter, but claimed Bennett sexually attacked Argento. So Argento allegedly sexually assaulted Jamie Bennett. And one of the pieces of evidence, I will say, that strongly suggests that she did it was that change in story. That is classic strategy. When people are oftentimes caught in something that was illegal, they will initially deny, then they will say that they did it, then they will say that they are victims. So again, allegedly, but seems to suggest. But let's leave it for a moment whether or not Asia Argento actually did this. But let's take a look at what the response was for Jimmy Bennett. So Jimmy Bennett, he went on a Italian TV show. So I believe they were both Italian. At the very least, they had worked together previously on a film and told his story. And the host, Mr. Galetti, says Mr. Galetti expressed skepticism that it was possible for a man to be sexually assaulted by a woman. He goes, "A woman's violence against a man or boy is technically difficult to understand," Mr. Galetti said. "Do you understand what I mean?" This is actually him talking to Jimmy. "A man has to take an active role, even if he is subjected to it." So that was his response. That was the host's response, that Jimmy could not possibly have been sexually assaulted, could not possibly have been raped, because literally it is impossible for a man to be raped. So in this case, Jimmy saying, "Yes, I was raped," and them saying, "No, that's an impossibility," is literally saying that in the signal detection theory, when men are being approached for sexual activity, there can be no false alarms. So if a man is engaged in sexual activity, there can be no false alarms, because it is impossible for them to be raped, because what they're saying is that if he's doing it, then he must want it. So that false alarm of "you're doing it, but he doesn't want it," is not possible. So when you take a look at that in a signal detection theory paradigm, such as this, what they're saying is that the actual situation for men who are receiving sexual attention, or in this case, actual sexual acts, the actual distribution is this distribution over here. And the evidence that allows you to have that distribution is literally, was there sexual activity? So if there was sexual activity, you're on the right side of the graph, and that's a hit because they must have wanted sexual attention. If there was not sexual activity, then that's on the left side of the graph. There's a correct rejection. They did not want sexual attention. What this says is that there cannot be any possibility of a false alarm. So this is the situation that Jimmy Bennett found himself in. And again, it's, well, let me ask you this. Does this seem realistic? No? Is this, well, I think we'll just see. What seems unrealistic about it?
What seems unrealistic about it?
I mean, let's make it explicit. I think we all feel it, right? But let's make it explicit.
Well, there could be many cases. What if someone's gay, they got raped by a woman, and they don't feel sexually attracted to women? Many cases. What if they're too young to even say yes or no? You know?
Yeah. So there's many cases where the act could occur, and yet it was still not accepted or not consented to by the male. So what if they were too young, like he was, right? Again, we have statutory rape laws because we do not feel that people of a certain age can intelligently consent to sexual activity. And I'm not going to open the door. Think about that in a signal detection paradigm as well. So we say that there is, I lost my train of thought. Yeah. So they could be too young, right? And that's a false alarm right there. You give them sexual activity, you should not. They do not want it. They could be inebriated, right? They might be drunk. They can't say no, right? They're not in a position to, and you take advantage of them. That's another way that it could occur. You might overpower them. I don't know what Jimmy Bennett's physical ability is. I don't know what Asia's physical ability is, but maybe he was overpowered at that time. So whatever it is, and I mean, even you can even know that maybe she's a power player in Hollywood, and he's a struggling actor just trying to make his way through, and he, you know, she blackmailed him into it. It's so many different ways that it could occur, but at least in Italy, this is the situation that they had, because not only was the host saying this, but when Jimmy Bennett mentioned his story, he was laughed at by the audience in the sense of, haha, no, but what really happened, that couldn't possibly be the case. It was almost too ludicrous for them to believe. All right. So again, there are some people that might believe this, and it might be difficult to convince them. But when you can analyze certain of these situations in a signal detection paradigm like this, sometimes you can see how ludicrous those arguments are. And if you have two distributions that are this far apart so that there's no false alarms and no misses, something is probably wrong in your analysis of the situation. All right, so we got about 10 minutes left, and I thought this was going to be the end of the the look at signal detection. I promise we will wrap it up next time, but I do want to just, again, it's such a powerful thing to analyze, and it's so important to understand the kind of dynamics that are going on, especially now when things are changing rapidly. Because when things change rapidly, again, it's criterion shifts, and the ability to analyze those criterion shifts and kind of know how to navigate stuff or what to do is a very powerful thing. So let me introduce the final study that we're going to look at. And this is one on power biases in sexual interest. So the question that the researchers wanted to test was, do people who have power expect more sexual interest from others? So do people in a position of power perceive other people as being more sexually interested in them? Okay, so not that they're more interested in other people, but they actually perceive the other people as being more interested in them. So here's how Kunstman and Maynard, this is their study, built the experiment. So they recruited introductory psychology students and brought them into the lab under the impression, so this was a stage manipulation, under the impression that they would be working with another participant on a decision-making task that simulated an organizational setting. So kind of like making decisions in a business. Actually, the experiment was about biases in sexual interest. So what they did was they took participants, and these participants were introductory psychology students, and the participants were male and female, and they were placed in opposite sex groups. So this was basically, this is a kind of move that is oftentimes used in relationship research, if just to kind of cast a wide net. So it's not that we're not interested in homosexual relationships or other types of relationships. It's just that when you're dealing with 100 subjects, you can expect the majority of them to be opposite sex or heterosexuals. So place in opposite sex groups. And this part was actually staged. There was no second partner, or there was no real second partner. And what they would do is they would be given a leadership questionnaire at the beginning of the study. And they were told that that was going to be used to assign the roles. But in reality, that was a lie. That was just a part of the experimental manipulation. So half of the subjects, regardless of what they responded on the questionnaire, half of them were placed in a leadership position where they controlled the decision and the rewards in the later part of the experiment. And then half of them were told that they would be treated as equals. So these individuals were placed either in a power position where they would have control over the final decisions that were being made by the pair, and they would have control over the rewards. So they could decide if the rewards at the end of the experiment were going to be distributed 50-50, or are they going to be distributed 90-10%? So I'm in power, I'm going to take 90, here's your 10%. They had that power. The ones in the equal position, they didn't have that power. So then prior to interacting, and this is the big kind of key moment here. Prior to interacting, they would watch a 2-minute video of their opposite sex partner. And again, partner is in quotes because these were staged. These weren't actual subjects. These were experimenters that were acting a certain way. So all the males saw the same female video. All the females saw the same male video. And then they would answer questions about the partner's sexual interest. And the experimenters wanted to know, did power change your perception of the person in the video, their sexual interest? So we'll leave today with the basic setup, and then I would like you all to speculate on what might happen when we take this up tomorrow. So we had 2 categories for subject sex and 2 categories for power condition. So we had male subjects and female subjects, and then we had leadership positions and equal positions. So those were multiplied in a factorial design. So you basically had males and females and males and females, and half of the males were placed in the leader position, and half of the males were placed in the equals position, and half of the females were placed in the leader's position, and half of the females were placed in the equals position. Then they watched a 2-minute video of their supposedly opposite sex partner. And once they watched the video, they answered a bunch of questions. And among those questions were questions about their partner's sexual interest. And I keep kind of emphasizing this because it does get a bit confusing. You need to remember that this is not how interested the subjects were in the person in the video. It was their estimate of how interested the person in the video would be in them, right? So it's literally them looking at the video and thinking to themselves, that person would probably really want to date me, versus that person would have no interest in me whatsoever, right? So that is what they were measuring. So they would ask them questions such as, I could see this person having sexual or romantic or sexual feelings for me. So on a 1 to 5 scale, what do you think? You know, on a 1, absolutely no interest, 5, completely interested. How would you rate, I could see this person having romantic or sexual feelings for me? Or I could see this person wanting to ask me out on a date. So again, it's the perceptions of interest of the other person. So that is the basic setup. And what we're going to do for next time is we're going to finish up here, I promise. And we're going to take a look at whether or not, if you have power over a person, does that affect your expectations of sexual interest? And what I want you to think about is what is going to happen in 3 conditions. All right, so this is your challenge for next class. Try to think about, what do you predict is going to happen? So first off, just concentrate on the people who were leaders versus the people who were equals. So people in that leadership position, the people that had power over the videotape individual, did they perceive that videotape individual as more sexually interested in them, right? Did they perceive that the video person would want to date them more? So did being placed in a power position versus an equal position affect that perception? Second question, do males or females have higher perceptions of expected sexual interest? So in general, did the males watch a female video and say, that person's really going to be interested in me? Versus did females watch a male video and say, that person's not really going to be interested in me? So is there a sex difference, right? Is there more expectations of sexual interest for males versus females, or vice versa? And then finally, in terms of perceived sexual interest, does being in a leadership position affect males differently than females, right? Does that leadership effect cause a different amount of change in males than it does in females? Those are your kind of challenge questions for next time when we take this up, and we're going to end signal detection. You can probably notice I really like signal detection. I think it's woefully undercovered, but I think we might have gone a little bit more into it than I was hoping for, but we'll finish it next time. Any questions on the setup before I let you go? Everybody's set? Everybody knows what they're going to, okay. So I can't wait to hear everybody's speculations next time, but other than that, we are done for today.